Welcome back to Refactoring Paleo Rows. My name is Thomas Moore. Today we're going to get into some code by looking at the application entry points. Typically in macOS and iOS apps, at least in the Cocoa era, have two main entry point files that we need to worry about. First is the main file, and then the application delegate. Let's talk about each of these files before we dive into the code. Main.m, the Objective-C version, or main.swift, the Swift version, is the main entry point of the app. This is the first thing the app will hit. The primary goal of this file is to take in the launch arguments and react. For example, you may put in some arguments in there to have the app behave a little bit differently in different situations, and that will allow you to change how the application acts. For example, you may want to have a different app delegate depending on what kind of building you are doing. For example, you may want an app delegate for a unit test, another app delegate for UI tests. Now, if you're on a very modern app, you won't see a main.m and a main.swift app. Since macOS 11, even iOS 2, and Xcode 12, that combination of things, the main function could actually be in your app delegate. So part of the protocol now for the application delegate for Mac and iOS is that the main function is in there. You can leave it in there and just use what you get, but you may have to do something a little bit differently, and you may have to recreate a main.swift or main.m file. We'll take a look at what's in it. It's not really well documented, I don't think, but a variety of different ways can be you can implement the main file. And if you go into GitHub, a lot of people have these files out there, and you can look at a wide variety of implementations. The app delegate, on the other hand, is a file that comes in a little bit later. So generally speaking, the part of the launching of the app is hit the main.m file, it launches the actual NS application, and then the NS application then tells the app delegate that it's ready to go, and you set up all your UI. And that's the purpose of the app delegate. So it's really a root object that gets triggered after the NS application has launched. And it is responsible for launching the rest of everything else. And that means it manages all the shared behavior, it sets up all the dependencies, all the classes, all the data, all the third-party services we might need, in response to other things that might happen too, for example, notifications. So it's a very important file for most projects. Simple projects, there may be very little here, but it's still quite important. Now, if you notice in the first item, I'm saying that the app delegate can be defined in a couple of different places. In iOS, for example, you quite typically see it defined in the main function. But it can also be configured in the main storyboard or main.zip file. This is always a little bit confusing and may have been one of the reasons why I have always had the belief that you can't have a Mac app without at least one zip file. So that may have been an erroneous view that we may not actually need to have the main.zip. And if I can get rid of it in this project, I will do so. But as of right now, we're going to probably keep it for a while and then see if we can figure out how to get rid of it. Okay, let's take a look at the code. This is the main.m file. It contains a main function that takes in a number of arguments and the actual array of arguments. And it simply launches the NS application main, passing in those arguments. It's really quite simple. And most of the time, you never have to touch this. And that's why in Xcode 12 or newer, much of this functionality can be taken up elsewhere. So that leads us, after the NS application main has launched, it's going to trigger the app delegate. Here we are in the app delegate. The function that's important here, at least in terms of the launching the app, is the application did finish launching. But here we only set up something for the color panel. We do nothing else here. But notice we also have this initialize function up top. If you're not familiar with Objective-C, the initialize function is something that you can utilize in Objective-C that will trigger once the application has read all the different classes and now can start this initialization function. So this is a function that isn't really part of the app delegate, but it's just a convenience tool to set something else up. I don't really like this the way it is, and when we switch things over, we're going to change how this is used. Okay, so that's the content of this. But of course, where is this being configured? It's not being configured in the main. It's not being configured here anywhere. And if we look into our info plist or in any of our build settings, it's not being set there either. So where is it being set? So if we look, We also have a main.zib. Let's go into that for a moment. The main.zib actually has a reference to the App Delegate. As you can see on the right, we have Xrow's App Delegate is our App Delegate, and our file owner is the NS application. And if we look at all the links and connections, there we go. We see that we have a delegate from the NS application going to the Xrow's App Delegate. So that's where it's being defined. So just out of curiosity, let's take a look at let's set some breakpoints and see how everything gets hit. Set one in main, see when that gets hit, and we'll set one in initialize and in the application did finish launching. As expected, we hit the main function first in the main.m file. Next, we hit the initialize in the Xrow's delegate. We're just now creating that class, not the instance, but the class. Next thing we should hit is the application did finish launching. And there it is. So it's launching pretty much as we expect. So let's go through the process of updating all this. The first thing I would like to do is use a more modern version of the main file. I don't have to. It works fine. The first thing I want to do is create a Swift version. As you can see, we've now sort of done it. We have to have a bridging header, and that's a way to get Objective-C code into Swift. It's just something we have to do. This also means that because we're now bringing in Swift, we want to bring in other things as well. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. What will this look like? We could just do something like this. We need Coco up there. And this is the equivalent, more or less, of what we had. Let's do this. Let's turn off main.m. To do that, we just take it out of the target, and then we add this one to the target. Oops, it's already added to the target. And then build and run. Worked great. And it's also giving us the same information that we're seeing down here, that there's some problems with some various stuff. We'll fix all that a little bit later, but now it's clearly working. So we can go ahead and get rid of our main.m. But I have to say this isn't the only possible change we can make. We'll come back to that in a minute. The App Delegate. Pretty simple, shouldn't have to change much. Let's go ahead and create a new class. Notice that this time I'm renaming it from Xrow's application App Delegate to just simple App Delegate. Putting these kinds of headers at the beginning of files is very common for Objective-C programmers because namespace collisions happen all the time with Objective-C. Swift is a little bit better about that, and we can make all the naming a little bit simpler. So let's create a class. What we want to do is have it conform application delegate. So we can conform to all this stuff, but let's just make it an NS object. And this should make our application our app delegate fully compliant. Now the thing about the application delegate protocol is that all the functions are optional, so we don't have to have anything. Let's just do application did finish launching. Now, as you can see, the only thing we have going on in here is just setting the color panel to show an alpha. So that's the same bit of functionality. Now, I'm not really sure how important setting this is, but I'm going to go ahead and do it for now. Now, what does this code really do? It's getting shared user defaults, creates a dictionary with a number. It's basically saying, for this key, our default value is going to be 0, and then we register defaults to the user defaults. So basically, it's a way of, instead of, if you've never launched the app before, instead of all the values being nulled out or 0, you have the opportunity to go ahead and make a default value. So if I wanted a number to be 27 by default, this is the kind of function you would use. So let's just copy this over just to be able to see it. And what I want to do here is just go ahead and do it in here. This is probably early enough that it's not a problem. So the call is a little simpler. We'll make a dictionary. One of the things we want to first find out is what the actual signature is. So defaults, register. So it's a string any. For simplicity, we'll rename this to user defaults. So that's the equivalent. So let's see if we can get this to work. So let's take this guy out and go back to main. In this case, the main.zip. So let's leave this here for now, but we're going to disconnect this connection. And we're going to redesignate what this is. Instead of xrows AppDelegate, it's now going to be just AppDelegate. Why did it do that? Go ahead and make this connection again. Let's rename it actually. Okay, so it's now pointing to this AppDelegate. All right, let's see if it works. Set some breakpoints. And build and run. It did not hit our function. So what's going on here? What's different? So what we can see here is that there's an unknown class using NSObject instead. So it doesn't know about this class for some reason. Let's delete this completely, then add a new one. And now we hit it. So it was just confused by me just manipulating things instead of just adding a new object. This also begs the question, do I really want it to work? Ultimately, I want to get off of the zips as much as possible. So is there any way I can get the app delegate to launch without having it in the zip? So let's take this out. And now we're going to go here. So instead of this approach, I'm doing this approach instead. Let me make a change. So we don't want it deallocating immediately. We want it to stay live. And let's see if this runs. So I took the app delegate out of here, put it into the main.swift file, and let's make sure we hit our delegate. Hit our delegate, and the app runs. Great. One of the things that we want to do is to improve the app while we're at it. What I want to improve is this, the user defaults. This is kind of a clumsy way to do it. And the question is, do we do this elsewhere? So if we remember our original code, we're using register defaults. So we do it at least 4 times. We have a bunch of different defaults we set at various times in the app. And they're usually in this initialize function. But I'm not fond of this. This is an interesting technique to do this at the time. As of now, I'm not really fond of this kind of approach to spread all this out. I can see why it made sense to me at the time, but I'm not a fan of it now. What do we want to do instead? Well, when we look at this, we want to accomplish 2 things. We want to make it very predictable where this kind of code is going to happen. And this is something that other pieces of code might interact with. And so eventually we want to make it testable or mockable. In this case, it's probably something we want to mock. And what I mean by that is for testing purposes, we want to have our user defaults to return values we want for a particular test. But we're not there yet. To start off, let's create a new class. Now we can make this a struct eventually, but for now, there's a possibility we might have to interact with Objective-C, and we'll probably need it as a class. We'll just call it application defaults. It's a bit long. There's a good chance I'm going to rename it at some point. But let's just start there. If we have to make it Objective-C or respond to the Objective-C protocol, we can in the future. And eventually we'll want to have it respond to another protocol for testing purposes. But for right now, all we're going to do is do the same functionality we have in the app delegate. So we can improve it later. So what functionality do we have? Well, the first thing when we look at this is we have a key. So why don't we create an enum that's going to be internal to this class that's going to hold these keys? And we're going to back it with a string. That way, we don't have to use quotes all the time. This string, enum case, is actually representing exactly the same string. One of my goals, long-term goals, is to get rid of strings defined like this as much as possible. In other words, we want to use enums, structs, that sort of thing, instead of strings as much as possible. So we can have a string. The next thing you know, we need a handle, essentially, to the user defaults. So when we create this class, automatically we're going to have user defaults set up in it. So what's next? Well, we need to be able to init this class. And we're going to create a default array. Now we can do this two ways. One, we can actually create the array here, or we can create it as a static variable, or something that just initializes and we have. But for now, we're just going to do this because we can let go of it once it's done. Remember, this is going to be string any. And we're going to define this array. We don't want this to be empty. So what we need to do is start with the string. What will this string be? Now, this will be a little bit long. So we want the raw value. We don't want the enum because we're actually talking to user defaults, which requires a string. So we need to convert this case to the string. And then we want to set a value. And now we just have to use it. There. Now we have a class that is holding this functionality together. And as we work through the rest of the code, we can move all that functionality we saw elsewhere into here. And chances are we'll probably move this again as it makes more sense. It may make more sense in different places. So that means on this side, we're going to have application defaults. We don't have to initialize it with anything, at least not yet. So we can create it, leave it there. And all this work that's being done here is already being done in this init function, and we can get rid of it. And if we want to, we can just go ahead and see if we hit it correctly. And we do. Now again, none of the things that we're doing today are set in stone. We're going to be changing these as necessary as we go through the app. But we have one last thing we have to do before we can call ourselves done with this small piece of work. We have to get rid of these files. We don't need them anymore. One last build. And we're done. Okay, so that's just refactoring our application defaults and our main.m to main.swift. As I mentioned, we now introduced Swift to our project. So likely in the next episode, we're going to start incorporating SwiftFormat and SwiftLint into our project. Those are two tools to help keep our code as clean as possible. It'll make sure that we're consistent in how we write our code. We'll talk about why that's important in the next time, but be aware that's something that should have been done with the Objective-C code, but I'm not going to fight that battle with Objective-C. I'm going to start fresh with Swift. So I hope you enjoyed this setup, and we'll meet again next time. My name's Thomas Moore, and this was Refactoring Paley Road.